The hum was the first thing you noticed about room 217. A low, electric thrum from the mini fridge wedged between the two desks. It was the white noise of collegiate life, a sound Dylan had already learned to tune out in his first 3 weeks at Northgate University. It was a constant, a given. Like the cinderblock walls painted a sterile, optimistic cream, or the smell of stale pizza and cheap air freshener that clung to the hallway carpet. Tonight, the hum was a comfort. Leo, his roommate, was out, probably at some pre-midterm study group that was really just an excuse to drink lukewarm beer. The silence in the room was a welcome reprieve. Outside, a late September wind rattled the window pane, a dry, whispering sound, like sand being sifted. Dylan was hunched over his laptop, the glow of a half-finished history paper illuminating his face. The words on the screen blurred together. The socio-economic impact of post-war agricultural policy, his eyelids felt heavy, weighted down. It was almost 2 a.m. The campus outside was a ghost town, a collection of dark buildings and lonely, orange-tinted streetlights. He stretched, his spine popping in a satisfying series of clicks. He should sleep. He had an 8 a.m. lecture he was already planning to regret. He clicked save, closed the laptop, and the room plunged into near darkness, save for the weak moonlight filtering through the blinds. He stood, his shadow long and distorted against the wall. The room was still. The only sounds were the wind and the ever-present hum of the fridge. He took a step toward his bed, and then he heard it. Knock, 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 3 distinct measured raps, not loud, not aggressive, just there, solid, like someone rapping their knuckles on a wooden door. Dylan froze halfway to his bed, his head turned toward the hallway door. He waited. The silence that followed was heavier now, charged with expectation. He listened for footsteps in the hall, the jingle of keys, Leo's clumsy return. Nothing. The hallway was as quiet as a tomb. He crept to the door, his bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. He pressed his ear against the wood, the paint cool against his skin. He heard the faint echo of a television from a room down the hall, the distant groan of the building's ancient heating system. But no one was there. No one was breathing or shuffling or waiting. He peered through the peephole. The fisheye lens showed a distorted, empty corridor, bathed in that sickly orange glow. He frowned. Maybe it was the room next door or the floor above. Sound traveled strangely in these old buildings. He backed away from the door, shaking his head. Stress, lack of sleep, that's what it was. Auditory hallucination. He'd read about it in a Psych 101 article. The brain plays tricks on you when it's tired. He climbed into his bed, pulling the thin university issue blanket up to his chin. He tried to settle back into the quiet to find the comforting rhythm of the fridge's hum. But something was wrong. The sound hadn't come from the hallway door. He replayed it in his mind, the 3 wooden raps. Knock, knock, knock. He traced the sound back to its source, a sudden, cold realization dawning on him. It had come from the closet. His closet. The cheap particle board wardrobe standing against the far wall, the sound had come from inside the room. He stared at the closet door, a simple, featureless slab of painted brown wood. It was closed tight. He told himself it was impossible. He was just tired, overtired. His brain was misfiring. But as he lay there, staring into the darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, on the other side of that wooden door, was waiting for him to answer. The morning light was a mercy. It streamed through the blinds in dusty stripes, chasing away the lingering shadows and the irrational fears of the night. Dylan awoke with a stiff neck and the lingering memory of the sound, now feeling foolish and distant in the light of day. Leo was snoring softly in the opposite bed, a fortress of pillows built around his head. A ghost in the closet, Dylan muttered to himself, swinging his legs out of bed. He felt ridiculous. He was a STEM major. He believed in data, in observable phenomena, not in knocks from empty wardrobes. It was probably a prank, someone down the hall with a remote speaker or some elaborate freshman hazing ritual he hadn't been warned about. He shuffled over to the closet, his curiosity outweighing his residual fear. He grabbed the small, brass-colored knob. It was cool to the touch. He pulled it open. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. A few sweatshirts hanging limply from plastic hangers, a stack of textbooks on the floor. His worn-out sneakers, nothing out of place. He ran a hand along the inside of the door, feeling the smooth, slightly cheap texture of the wood veneer. Nothing. No hidden speakers, no wires, no sign of tampering. He was about to close it, to write the whole thing off as a waking dream when he saw them. On the inside of the door, near the bottom, just above the floor. 3 distinct dark smudges. They were arranged in a small, tight cluster. They weren't just dirt. They had form. They looked like fingertips. Like someone had pressed their fingers into a pile of ash or soot and then carefully, deliberately touched the door from the inside, but they weren't handprints. They were too long, too thin. The smudges were elongated, tapering to unnaturally sharp points like claws that had been filed down to nubs. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, washed over him. He hadn't put them there. His hands were clean. And the closet had been packed with his things since move-in day. No one had been inside. He stared, his mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Old stains he'd never noticed, dirt from his shoes, but he knew with a certainty that terrified him that these marks were new. "What are you looking at?" Dylan jumped, slamming the closet door shut. Leo was sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. His hair was a mess and he looked pale even in the morning light. "Nothing," Dylan said, his voice a little too quick. "Just thought I heard a mouse or something." Leo grunted. He didn't seem to register the lie. He just swung his feet to the floor, looking exhausted. "Dude, I slept like crap, had the weirdest dream." "Yeah?" Dylan asked, trying to sound casual as he leaned against the closet, hiding the spot. "Yeah, I dreamt there was someone in the room," Leo said, stretching his arms over his head. "Just standing over there, by your closet." He pointed a lazy finger. "Just standing in the corner watching me." Dylan's blood ran cold. "What did they look like?" Leo shrugged, already stumbling toward the door. "I don't know, it was dark. They were just tall and still, creepy as hell." He yawned, grabbing the doorknob. "Anyway, I need coffee, like intravenously." He left, the door clicking shut behind him. Dylan was alone again. He waited a beat, then slowly, hesitantly, opened the closet door. The 3 sooty fingerprints were still there. Unmoving, undeniable, proof of something he couldn't explain. He thought of what Leo said, standing in the corner watching me. He looked from the ashen marks to the empty space in the corner of the room, and for the first time, the daylight offered no comfort at all. The next few days were a study in forced normalcy. Dylan threw himself into his coursework, spending long hours in the library, surrounded by the comforting quiet of turning pages and the low murmur of other students. He told himself the marks in the closet were a prank, a clever, elaborate prank by Leo, designed to mess with him. It was the only explanation that made sense. He even tried to convince himself of it, picturing Leo sneaking into the room with a bag of charcoal dust, carefully applying the smudges before Dylan woke up. But the explanation felt thin, flimsy. Leo wasn't that clever or that cruel, and he certainly wasn't a good enough actor to fake the deepening exhaustion that was starting to carve dark circles under his eyes. Leo had stopped talking about his dreams. In fact, he'd stopped talking much at all. He moved through their shared space like a wraith, his movements slow and tired. He'd lost weight. His already lean frame seemed to be shrinking, his clothes hanging looser on his shoulders. He'd started sleeping with a small desk lamp on, casting long, distorted shadows across the room all night. "You okay, man?" Dylan asked one afternoon, finding Leo staring blankly at a page in his chemistry textbook, his coffee untouched beside him. Leo blinked slowly, as if surfacing from a great depth. "Yeah, fine, just tired." "You're always tired," Dylan pressed gently. "You're not sleeping, are you?" A flicker of something, fear, anger, crossed Leo's face. "I sleep." The words were clipped defensive. It's just the light. It's hard to get good rest with the lamp on. So turn it off, Dylan said. Leo's gaze shot toward the closet, a quick, almost imperceptible movement. No, I like it on. He turned a page in his textbook, a clear signal that the conversation was over. The unease in the room was becoming a physical presence. It was a tension in the air, a silence that felt heavier than it should. Dylan found himself watching the closet out of the corner of his eye. He'd scrubbed the sooty marks off the inside of the door with a wet wipe until the veneer was raw, but it did nothing to erase the image from his mind. He knew they had been there. He tried bringing it up with Sarah, a friend from his history class, framing it as a hypothetical. They were sitting on a bench in the campus quad, the autumn air crisp and cool. So, funny story, he began, forcing a laugh. My roommate is trying to convince me our dorm is haunted, talking about weird knocks and figures in the dark. Sarah rolled her eyes, taking a sip of her latte. Oh my God, a freshman haunting. It's a rite of passage. Someone in my brother's year swore a ghost kept stealing his left socks. It was his RA just messing with him. She grinned. Tell Leo to stop watching those ghost hunter shows. Dylan's forced smile felt brittle. Yeah, probably. He was alone in this. Leo was retreating into a shell of fear and exhaustion, and everyone else would just laugh. The rational world he had always trusted was offering no solutions. The problem wasn't a ghost that stole socks. The problem was the look in Leo's eyes. The problem was the memory of those long, ashen fingerprints. That night, Dylan lay awake long after Leo had fallen into a fitful, twitching sleep, his desk lamp casting a sickly yellow glow. Dylan stared at the closet door. He felt like a child again, afraid of the monster under the bed, but this was different. This wasn't a childish fear. This was a cold, adult certainty that something was fundamentally wrong. He closed his eyes, trying to force himself to sleep, but behind his eyelids he could see them. The 3 black marks stark against the white door like a stain that couldn't be washed away. It happened a week after the first time, a Tuesday. The clock on Dylan's phone flipped from 1:59 a.m. to 2:00 a.m. He was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. He hadn't been able to find proper sleep for days. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind, sent a jolt through his nervous system. Leo was asleep, or at least pretending to be. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper in the semi-darkness of the lamp-lit room. The air was thick with a silent, waiting dread. Dylan had started to recognize the feeling. It was a pressure change, a drop in the emotional temperature of the room that happened every night around this time. He held his breath. He was listening, waiting. He didn't know if he wanted it to happen or not. Part of him craved the confirmation, the proof that he wasn't going crazy. The other part was paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like it was freezing his blood. At exactly 2:00 a.m. it came. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was different, louder, sharper, not a tentative rap, but a hard, insistent summons. It wasn't just on the closet door. The sound seemed to come from the very bones of the wardrobe itself, a deep, resonant thudding that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a sound that demanded to be heard. In the other bed, Leo let out a choked gasp. He shot upright, his eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. He wasn't faking, this was real. His gaze darted frantically around the room before landing on the closet. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The sound had shattered Dylan's last wall of denial. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a dream. This was happening. He sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at Leo, then at the closet. The plain brown door seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy in the dim light. "Did you?" Dylan started to whisper, but his voice caught in his throat. Leo didn't answer. He just stared at the closet, his body trembling. He looked like a prey animal that had just scented a predator. Then, a new sound, a soft, scraping noise. SCRRRRRRRR. It was coming from inside the closet. the sound of a fingernail or something harder being dragged slowly down the wood of the door from the inside. A long, deliberate scratch that seemed to trace a line from top to bottom. That was what broke Leo. He scrambled out of bed with a raw, guttural cry of fear. He didn't grab his phone, his keys, his wallet. He just ran. He fumbled with the lock on the hallway door, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the deadbolt. He wrenched the door open and fled into the empty, orange-lit hallway, his bare feet slapping against the linoleum. The door swung shut behind him, leaving Dylan alone in the room, alone with the silence. The scraping had stopped, the knocking was over. The only sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart. He didn't move, he couldn't. He just sat there, frozen on the edge of his bed, staring at the closet door. He knew, with a chilling, gut-wrenching certainty, that Leo wasn't coming back. The room felt vast and empty now, but he had never felt more watched in his entire life. The question wasn't if something was in the closet anymore. The question was what it wanted, and he feared he was beginning to understand. The lore he'd once laughed at echoed in his mind. It's something that wants to be invited in. He had asked, "Who's there?" the first time, a question, an acknowledgement. Had that been enough? Had he issued an invitation without even realizing it? Leo didn't come back. His side of the room remained a testament to his hasty departure, a rumpled bed, an open textbook, a cold cup of coffee. The a perpetually stressed senior named Mark, had stopped by the next day. Dylan had mumbled something about a family emergency, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth. Mark had just nodded, made a note on his clipboard, and said Leo would have 48 hours to officially check out or he'd be fined. The bureaucracy of it all felt absurd, like discussing property taxes while your house was on fire. Dylan was truly alone now. The isolation was a physical weight. The room felt wrong, imbalanced. During the day, he was a ghost on campus, moving through crowds of laughing students, feeling utterly disconnected from their reality. At night, he'd sit at his desk, the door to the hallway locked and a chair wedged under the handle, and he would stare at the closet. He didn't sleep, he waited. But the knocking didn't come back. The silence was in some ways worse. It was a predatory silence, full of potential. The fear didn't fade, it mutated, sinking deeper into his bones. He started noticing things. A floorboard creaking in the corner when he hadn't moved. The closet door, which he always made sure was shut tight, would sometimes be open a crack when he returned from a class. The clothes inside seemed disturbed. A sweatshirt on the floor that he was sure had been on a hanger. Small, inexplicable shifts in his environment that made him question his own sanity. He knew he couldn't go to the university authorities. They'd send him to counseling, put him on academic probation, or worse. They'd think he was crazy. Maybe he was. He needed answers, not platitudes. He turned to the only place he could think of, the internet. He started with simple searches: 3 knocks legend, Midwest folklore knocking, dorm room haunting. The results were a predictable mix of cheesy creepypastas and ghost hunting forums. But he dug deeper, past the fiction, looking for origins, for patterns. He found it on a digitized archive of a defunct local newspaper from a small town in southern Illinois, dated 1958. The article was grainy, the text slightly blurred. Farming family perishes in mystery blaze. It described a farmhouse that had burned to the ground. The fire was so intense it had left nothing but ash and scorched earth. The family, a mother, a father, 2 children, were all presumed dead, but their bodies were never found. The cause of the fire was undetermined. That wasn't the scary part. The scary part was in the witness testimonies from the neighbors. Several of them told the reporter about the strange stories the family had told in the weeks leading up to the fire. They'd complained of hearing knocking in the middle of the night, 3 sharp raps, always around 2 a.m. Not at their door, but from inside their walls, from their closets, from beneath their floorboards. The father had told his neighbor, a man named Stanley Miller, that it felt like something was trying to get in. Dylan's breath hitched. He kept reading. The last paragraph was an interview with the town sheriff. He dismissed the stories as local superstition. He mentioned an old piece of folklore, a warning passed down through generations in that area. A story about something that wanders the quiet places, something born of fire and loneliness. It can't cross a threshold on its own. It has to be acknowledged, invited. The legend said that if you hear 3 knocks from a place where no one could be knocking, you must remain silent. If you speak to it, even just to ask who's there, you have opened a door. A cold sweat broke out on Dylan's forehead. Who's there? The 2 words he had spoken into the darkness of his room. He hadn't just acknowledged it. He had engaged with it. He slammed his laptop shut. The click echoed in the silent room. He stood up, pacing back and forth, the small space feeling like a cage. The lore, the newspaper article, Leo's terror, it was all coalescing into a single horrifying truth. He wasn't being haunted by a ghost. He was being targeted by a predator that followed ancient rules. As he paced, his foot bumped something on the floor near his bed. He looked down. It was his desk lamp, the one he'd taken to keeping on his nightstand. It must have fallen. He bent to pick it up, and his fingers brushed against the metal shade. It was covered in a fine, dark powder. A gritty, black dust that smeared under his thumb. He brought his fingers to his nose. It smelled faintly of charcoal, of burnt wood. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with a new, frantic terror. He saw it on the windowsill, on the top of his dresser. A fine, almost invisible layer of black ash settled on every horizontal surface. It hadn't been there this morning. It was as if a handful of soot had been sprinkled from the ceiling, settling like malevolent snow. Then he heard a sound from the closet, not a knock, not a scrape. A soft, metallic rattle, the sound of the doorknob turning slowly from the inside. The rattle of the doorknob sent a spike of pure adrenaline through Dylan's heart. He scrambled backward, his back hitting the opposite wall, his eyes locked on the closet. The small brass knob was visibly vibrating, turning a few degrees to the left, then back to the right, a slow, deliberate motion. It was impossible. The mechanism was only on the outside. There was no way to turn it from within. He didn't scream. The fear was too deep for that. It was a cold, silent paralysis. He watched, breathless, as the knob twisted again, more forcefully this time, accompanied by a low, splintering groan from the wood around the latch. Whatever was inside was testing the door, feeling for a weakness. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand here and wait for the cheap particle board to give way. He needed proof. He needed to see it. The thought was insane, born of desperation and a terror-fueled curiosity that was overriding all his survival instincts. If he showed someone, the police, the campus administration, a video of this, they couldn't dismiss it. They couldn't call him crazy. His eyes darted to his desk, his laptop. It had a webcam, but that wasn't right. He needed something he could position, something that could see in the dark. His phone. No, the battery wouldn't last the night. Then he remembered. The small, blocky camera he'd bought for a film studies project last year. A cheap action cam with a surprisingly decent night vision mode. It was in the bottom drawer of his desk, buried under a mess of cables and old notebooks. With a surge of purpose, he pushed himself off the wall, his movements stiff and robotic. He kept his eyes on the closet door as he sidled over to his desk. The rattling had stopped. The silence was somehow even more menacing. He fumbled through the drawer, his fingers closing around the cool, plastic casing of the camera. He found a mini tripod and a portable power bank, his mind working with a strange, detached clarity. He had to set it up without being obvious. Could it see him? Could it sense what he was doing? He felt a profound sense of being watched, scrutinized. He worked quickly, his hands shaking as he attached the camera to the tripod and plugged it into the power bank. He placed the setup on his bookshelf, nestled between a thick psychology textbook and a stack of literary journals. It had a clear, unobstructed view of the closet door and a wide portion of the room. He turned on the night vision mode. The small screen on the back of the camera flickered to life, painting the room in an eerie monochrome of greens and blacks. The closet door looked like a gateway to nothingness, a dark rectangle in a sea of grainy light. The image was clear. Perfect. Now came the hardest part, waiting. He knew it wouldn't perform for him. It was patient. It had its own schedule. It would wait until he was asleep, until he was vulnerable. He had to feign sleep. He had to climb into that bed and pretend to be unconscious while every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to follow Leo out into the hallway and never look back. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the faint smell of ash. He turned off the main room light, leaving only the small desk lamp on Leo's empty nightstand. The room plunged into the familiar, ominous twilight. He walked to his bed, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He pulled the covers up to his chin, forcing his body to lie still, his breathing to even out. He faced away from the closet, toward the wall, but his eyes were wide open, staring at the blank cream-colored paint. He could feel the camera on the bookshelf behind him, its single, unblinking eye aimed at the darkness. His tiny, silent witness. The room was still. The only sound was the hum of the fridge and the frantic, silent beat of his own heart. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, every muscle tensed, waiting for the clock to strike 2, waiting for the performance to begin. He was no longer just the victim. He was the audience. Time crawled. Every minute that ticked by on Dylan's phone screen, lying face down on his nightstand, felt like an hour. He tracked the slow march toward 2 a.m. with a torturous awareness. 145, 152, 157. The air in the room grew heavy, cold. The ambient hum of the mini fridge seemed to fade, as if the space was holding its breath. Dylan's own breathing was a tight, controlled rhythm, a desperate attempt to mimic the cadence of sleep. He didn't dare move. He didn't dare look. He just lay there, a live wire of terror, his entire consciousness focused on the space behind him. He could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere, the pressure change, the silent arrival. His phone screen, dark for minutes, would be ticking over now. 159, 200. Silence. For a terrifying moment he thought nothing would happen, that he had scared it off, that he had imagined it all. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. 1 second, 2, 3. Then, a sound so soft he almost missed it. A faint, dry creak. The closet door. He squeezed his eyes shut, a wave of nausea washing over him. It was happening. The camera was recording. He pictured the scene in grainy night vision, the door slowly, silently swinging inward, opening a sliver of deeper, more absolute blackness into the room. He heard a soft, dragging sound, the noise of fabric or something heavy and boneless being pulled across a wooden floor. It was slow, methodical. It stopped. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't empty, it was occupied. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond his senses, that something was now out of the closet. It was in the room with him, standing in the space between the wardrobe and his bed. He could feel its presence like a patch of cold air, a void in the already dim room. He imagined it turning its head, a slow, deliberate motion, its attention shifting from the closet to the 2 beds, to Leo's empty, rumpled mattress. Then to him. He felt a gaze on his back, a weight so intense it felt like a physical pressure. It knew he wasn't asleep. It had to know, was this a test? His body was rigid, every muscle screaming. He fought the primal urge to bolt, to turn and face it, to scream. He had to see the footage. He had to let the scene play out. And then came the knocks, but they weren't on the door. Thump, A soft, fleshy, yet heavy sound. It came from the floor near the foot of his bed. Thump. Closer this time, like it was crawling. Thump. Right beside his bed, 3 knocks, not with knuckles on wood, but with something dense and soft on the linoleum floor, an invitation offered from its side this time. Dylan's breath hitched in his throat, a tiny, involuntary gasp. The silence that followed was absolute. He waited for another sound, for it to touch his bed, to pull at his blanket, but nothing came. The seconds stretched into minutes. The cold spot in the room seemed to dissipate. The pressure on his back lessened. Slowly, tentatively, he sensed that it was retreating. He heard the same soft, dragging sound again, moving away from him back toward the closet. Another faint creak of the door, this time swinging shut, and then nothing. The hum of the fridge returned, flooding the silence. The oppressive weight was gone. It was over. He lay there for what felt like a lifetime, not daring to move until the first hint of gray dawn began to seep through the blinds. Only then did he allow his body to unlock, to tremble with the violent, suppressed terror of the last hour. He had survived, and somewhere on a tiny memory card, nestled in a camera on his bookshelf, was the proof. The chilling image he would carry forever was not what he heard, but what he imagined the camera saw. A dark form, crawling out of a closet and knocking on the floor, patiently, beside the bed of a boy pretending to be asleep. Dawn broke, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. Dylan hadn't moved. He lay drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom feeling of that presence still crawling on his skin. He felt violated, contaminated. The sun rose higher, and the familiar, safe light of morning filled the room, but it brought no comfort. The light couldn't reach the darkness that had taken root in room 217. Finally, with movements that were slow and stiff, he forced himself out of bed. His eyes went immediately to the camera on the bookshelf. The small power light was still on. It had worked. It had captured everything. His hands trembled as he took the camera down. He didn't want to watch it. He had to watch it. He unplugged the power bank and carried the small device to his desk, sinking into his chair. He felt hollowed out, fragile. He plugged the camera into his laptop, and a new drive icon appeared on his desktop. A single video file was inside, Night 001, MP4. He took a deep, shuddering breath and double-clicked. The video player opened. The screen was black for a moment, and then the grainy, green and black world of his dorm room at night filled the screen. The angle was perfect. It showed the closet door, most of his bed, and the empty space in between. The time code at the bottom of the screen reads 013014. He could see the lump of his own body under the covers, facing the wall. He fast-forwarded. The numbers on the time code blurred. He slowed it down as it approached 2 a.m. 015-958-015-959-020-000. The room was perfectly still. For a few seconds, nothing happened. He felt a flash of doubt. Had he imagined the creak? 020007. The closet door, it moved. It didn't swing open. It seemed to warp. The edges of the door bent slightly inward, and then a sliver of perfect, non-reflective blackness appeared. A blackness that seemed to absorb the night vision light. The crack widened silently. Dylan leaned closer to the screen, his heart pounding. From that sliver of absolute dark, something emerged. It wasn't a hand, it was an arm. Long, unnaturally thin, and the color of charcoal. It was matte black, covered in what looked like fine, caked ash. There was no skin texture, no muscle definition. Just a smooth, horrifyingly alien limb. It moved with a slow, serpentine grace, uncoiling from the darkness within the closet. The arm reached the floor. It didn't have a hand, not really. The end of the limb tapered into 3 long, finger-like appendages, also coated in that dead, black soot. The arm pulled the rest of its form forward. Dylan couldn't see a body, only a shifting mass of the same profound darkness just inside the closet's threshold. The ashen limb dragged itself across the floor. It moved with a sickening, boneless fluidity. It stopped at the foot of his bed, right in the camera's frame. It paused as if sensing the lens. Then, it lifted one of its appendages and brought it down on the linoleum floor. Thump. The video's microphone picked up the sound perfectly. A dead, fleshy impact. It dragged itself closer. Thump, closer still, right beside the bed, inches from where his feet were under the blanket. Thump, the 3 knocks. It waited. In the video, Dylan saw his own body flinch, the blanket moving slightly, the gasp he'd tried to suppress. The thing on the floor didn't react. It remained perfectly still for a full minute. Then, just as slowly as it came, it dragged itself back to the closet. The black arm coiled back into the sliver of darkness, which then sealed shut, the door clicking softly into place as if it had never been opened. The video continued. The time code reads 020516. Dylan kept watching, mesmerized with horror. He had the proof. Indisputable, terrifying proof. Then, at 020822, the image on the screen began to change. Heavy static rolled across the frame. The green night vision flickered, distorting. The sound devolved into a low, humming buzz. It looked like the signal was degrading, the file corrupting itself before his very eyes. He was about to stop the playback, to try and save the file, when the static cleared for a final, shocking moment. The image was no longer from the bookshelf. The camera was on the floor, looking up, and filling the entire frame was a face, his face, Dylan's face, but it was wrong. His eyes were wide, unnervingly wide, and the pupils were dilated into black pools that swallowed the iris. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the stark night vision. His mouth was curled into a slight, knowing smile that was utterly devoid of warmth or humanity. His face, his captured face, leaned closer to the camera lens, so close the image distorted at the edges. A whisper emerged from the laptop speakers, a sound that was both his voice and not his voice. It was a dry, rasping sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "It's inside me." The screen went black. The file was gone. The video player gave an error message, file not found or corrupt. Dylan sat back in his chair, a cold, hollow dread filling him from the inside out. He looked at his own hands resting on the desk. He felt a strange tingling in his fingertips. He slowly lifted his hand and looked at his palm. It was his hand. But for a fleeting, terrifying moment, it didn't feel like his own. He felt like a passenger in his own body. He understood now. The knocking, the waiting, the performance. It wasn't trying to get into the room. It had been in the room all along. It was trying to get into him. And his question, "Who's there?" weeks ago, had been the key. His observation, his fear, his focus. That was the invitation. The camera wasn't just a witness. It was the final step. It was proof for it, not for him. The feeling of being a passenger faded, replaced by his own frantic terror. But he knew it was still there. A silent partner coiled in the back of his mind, waiting. He knew what he had to do, but he also knew, with a terrifying new certainty, that it wouldn't let him leave. The next morning, the sun rose on an undisturbed room. The bed was made. The desk was clear. The laptop was closed. There was no sign of the frantic terror of the night before. There was no sign of Dylan. Around 11 a.m., Mark, the Raw, did his rounds. He had the paperwork for Leo's official checkout and a fine notice for an unapproved departure. He knocked on the door of room 217. "Dylan, housekeeping," he called out, a joke he used on all his residents. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "Dylan, man, I know you're in there. We gotta talk about Leo's stuff." Silence. Mark sighed, annoyed. He pulled out his master key card and swiped it. The light on the handle flashed green, but the door didn't budge. He tried again. Green flash, no movement. He jiggled the handle. It was locked from the inside. The deadbolt was thrown. He frowned. That was against regulations. He put his ear to the door, listening. He heard nothing. Not the hum of the fridge, not the rustle of movement. Just a deep, profound silence. "Dylan," he called out, his voice sharper now, "open the door or I'm calling campus security to force it." Still nothing. A prickle of unease ran down Mark's spine. This felt weird. He dealt with hungover students, sleeping students, students who were actively avoiding him. But the silence from this room felt different. It felt vacant. He made the call. 2 campus security officers arrived 20 minutes later, a large man with a world-weary expression and his younger, more eager partner. They announced themselves loudly, received the same silence, and after a brief consultation, used a special tool to force the deadbolt back. The door swung open with a heavy click. The 3 of them peered inside. The room was pristine, immaculate. Leo's side was still messy, his things a clear sign of a person who had fled, but Dylan's side was perfect. His bed was made with military precision, the corners tucked tight. His desk was empty except for his closed laptop, placed perfectly in the center. His bookshelf was organized, the books flush with the edge of the shelf. The closet door was closed. There was no note, no sign of a struggle, no Dylan. "Maybe he went out the window," the younger officer suggested, walking over to check. He pushed the blinds aside. They were on the 2nd floor, a straight drop to the concrete sidewalk below. The window was locked from the inside. The older officer walked the small space. He ran a hand over the perfectly made bed. He looked at the dust-free desk. "Looks more like he just evaporated," he muttered. He opened the closet, hangers with a few sweatshirts, textbooks, sneakers, nothing. They logged it as an unauthorized departure. They sealed the room, pending an investigation into a missing student. They questioned Leo, who they found sleeping on a friend's couch in another building. Leo was incoherent, pale and shaking, talking about knocking and shadows. They sent him to Student Health Services, assuming a drug-induced psychotic break. The official story became that Dylan Williams, a promising freshman, had suffered some kind of mental health crisis, packed a bag in the middle of the night, and simply walked away from campus. His parents were notified. Missing person posters went up. But those who worked in the residence hall knew the story didn't fit. How did he lock the deadbolt and the window from the inside and then vanish? The room became a piece of campus lore, the empty room at the end of the hall. It remained sealed for the rest of the semester, a silent, sterile memorial to a boy who was there 1 minute and gone the next. No one went inside, no one touched anything. But as the weeks went on, custodians cleaning the hallway late at night started reporting a strange smell coming from under the door. A faint, cloying scent, like burnt wood and ash. The semester ended. The dorm emptied out, the hallways falling silent. Winter break settled over Northgate University, blanketing the campus in a quiet layer of snow. Room 217 remained sealed, a dark spot in an otherwise empty building. But the story didn't end. It lived on in the rooms nearby. In room 219, 2 sophomores, back early from the break to work campus jobs, were trying to sleep. The building was almost supernaturally quiet, the snow outside muffling all sound. It was the kind of deep winter silence that lets you hear everything. One of them, a girl named Chloe, sat up in bed. She nudged her roommate, Maya, who was already awake. "Did you hear that?" Chloe whispered into the darkness. "I thought I was dreaming," Maya whispered back. They both listened. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. It was coming through their shared wall. From the empty, sealed room next door, knock, knock. Knock, 3 slow, deliberate raps, muffled by the cinder block but clear in the profound silence. The girls looked at each other, their eyes wide in the gloom. They knew the stories. They knew that room was supposed to be empty. Locked, sealed, they held their breath, waiting, praying it wouldn't happen again. The silence stretched. Then another sound came through the wall. It was not a knock, it was a voice, a whisper. So faint it was almost subliminal, yet it cut through the silence like a razor. It was a dry, rasping sound, like the voice of 1,000 autumns of ash and dust and endless waiting. It was impossible to tell if it was male or female. It wasn't human. It was something else, wearing a human voice like a borrowed coat, and it spoke one simple sentence that echoed not in their ears but in the deepest, most terrified parts of their minds. This time, it's going to knock on your door.